What is up, YouTube? My name is Luke, and welcome back to my channel. Today, I am going over my own personal tier list for the upcoming Hartford Regionals that is coming up this weekend. Um, I want to say a disclaimer real quick that this is my tier list. I'm going to define what I mean by tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So I'm not stating any of this as facts. It's just my educated opinions on which decks are in which tiers based on my own vigorous testing, tournaments, and meta speculation. And this is also just for the Hartford Regionals. League Cup meta calling and League Cup tier lists are a little bit different because it's based on a more consolidated meta. So let's get right into it. I'm going to define tier 1 as decks that are inherently strong and have few weaknesses and or weaknesses that are not easily exploited. And these are the decks that I would pick to make it in the top 8 and possibly win the whole tournament. So the first deck of tier 1 is Gardevoir, and I favor the Sylveon version. So I think Gardevoir Sylveon is probably the strongest deck in the format. It's just very inherently strong. Gardevoir GX is both the attacker and the Energy Excel engine. It has infinite damage output. It's really nice that Sylveon GX can attack as early as turn 1 because of Eevee's energy evolution. The deck has built-in consistency with Gallade's Premonition, which can be paired with either Octillery's Abyssal Hand or Oranguru's Instruct, depending on which one, if either, you like. Plea GX is a really amazing attack. It can be used to disrupt an opposing setup deck, such as Vikabulu, Metagross, or especially, especially the Mirror Match. It's really, really nice in the Mirror Match. Its weaknesses are the deck's weaknesses are really ability lock, and getting damage spread against you, and then Espeon EX using Miraculous Shine to devolve your Pokemon. But you can stop both of those with the ability lock. You can stop Garbotoxin with Field Blower, and it's a lot easier to get Field Blower if you are using Sylveon because you can just Magical Ribbon for it. Or if you're using Skyla, that's another out. And the other weakness I mentioned was getting damage spread on your board and then Espeon devolving you. And that's easy. You can just simply tech in a Mr. Mime if you think damage spread is going to be really relevant. And then Mr. Mime stops all damage to your bench from attacks. So that kind of stops Tapu Koko Flying Flip. It stops Ice Blade from Alolan Ninetales. So that's really good to stop that. I think Gardevoir's best matchup is probably Fire variants, because they need a lot of energy to attack, and you punish them for that with Infinite Force. And its worst matchup is probably Metagross or Greninja. Greninja's probably a little more manageable just because they are known for having a less consistent start. So Metagross GX is what you don't want to see playing this deck. My next tier 1 deck is Golisopod Garbodor. This just won the regionals over in Bremen. Their meta is a little different than ours, but it's a very strong deck. It's seeing a lot of success in League Cups around the US, especially last weekend. I think it was really prevalent in League Cups. I know it won a League Cup by me, and then 2 of my testing partners took top 4 at separate League Cups with Golisopod Garbodor. So I think that the growth of Golisopod Garbodor and also its strength is due to 3 things. One, it's really consistent because you don't need a lot of parts to keep the deck to get the deck going and then keep it going. You just need like an energy for the first impression. You need the Golisopod, and then on your next turns you need like a Guzma and something to retreat, or an Acerola and another Wimpod to evolve. So it's really easy to get it going and keep it going. 2, I think it grew in popularity because of its good matchup against Greninja, and Greninja was getting popular in League Cups a couple weeks ago. And three, it has really good matchups around the board. Like, it has a lot of 50-50s and winnable matchups. It has a few really good matchups, like against Greninja. And it has a couple of unfavorable matchups, mostly fire variants, but they're still winnable. I've seen plenty of Golisopod Garbodors beat fire variants. So I think this is a good deck. Its weakness is it. Excuse me. Its weaknesses are pretty much fire type Pokemon. But like I said, you can still beat fire type decks. Garbotoxin can lock Volcanion decks, like if they're relying on Steam Up to power up. Then Baby Volk can't one shot you as easily. And like I said, its strengths are it's easy to set up and stream attackers, and it has ability lock with Garbotoxin, so that's really good. Alright, so those are the only two decks I feel comfortable putting in Tier 1, with my definition being that that Tier 1 is inherently strong decks with weaknesses that are not easily exploited, and they're also consistent decks. If I had to add one more deck to Tier 1, it would be Metagross. That's kind of like Tier 1.5 for me. It's like right between Tier 1 and Tier 2. So let's go on to my definition of Tier 2. Tier 2 is the decks in Tier 2 are fairly strong against a large portion of the meta. Some weaknesses and or some inconsistencies. These decks, I wouldn't be surprised if they make top 8 and if they take up a portion of the top 32 or whatever day 2 is if it's larger in top 32. And depending on what top cut looks like, one of these could very possibly win the whole tournament. So my first deck in Tier 2 is Metagross GX. It has a favored matchup versus both Guardy and Golisopod Garb. Both decks I listed as Tier 1. So that's very good. It does need a setup that often takes a few turns, which can allow decks to take an early lead against it. But most of the time, if Metagross gets set up with 2 or 3 Metagross, it can usually stream attacks, max potion to heal, and just win the game. Its best matchup is Gardevoir, and its worst matchup is either Fire variants or Greninja. It has a tough time versus both of those. So yeah, Metagross is, I think it's a good choice for Hartford, just because it usually beats Gardevoir and it's favored versus Golisopod Garbodor. It's not super favored in my testing versus Golisopod Garb, but you can get the upper hand because of your max potions, your field blowers to get rid of the Garbotoxin's Floatstone. You usually can take control in that matchup. But like I said, this deck stumbles to get ready sometimes, and Golisopod Garb can take advantage of that and take an early lead and win off of that. I do think it's a good choice, but a lot of fire decks might pop up, and those are very hard to beat. Next in Tier 2, I have Ho-Oh Salazzle. This is basically a fire toolbox that focuses on Ho-Oh to take early prizes and Salazzle to clean up later. The issues I have with it is you're not always going to hit the turn 1 Kiawe, and its guarding matchup is just not very good. Oftentimes in testing, especially right at the beginning of Burning Shadows being legal, in testing it would look like you had the upper hand early game because you were taking prizes, you have a 4 energy Ho-Oh set up, everything's looking good, and then Guardy just gets its late game power going, and Guardy usually wins the matchup. So as long as you get turn 1 Kiawe against most decks, you're going to be in a pretty good position putting on that early pressure with Ho-Oh dealing 180 right off the bat on turn 2. So it's a very strong deck. Its best matchup is Metagross probably, and its worst matchup is Gardevoir, I'd say. I think it's definitely a contender going into this weekend just because of its speed and power right off the bat, and also Salazzle is a great cleanup with its Diabolical Claws after you've taken some prizes with Ho-Oh. My next and last deck I have put into my tier 2 is Turtonator Volcanion. Again, it's sort of a fire toolbox, but this time it's focusing on Turtonator GX and using Volcanion Steam Up to increase the damage. And also it uses Baby Volk, and it still has it normally runs a Ho-Oh or two, but not Salazzle. It's more about using Turtonator to Bright Flame a couple times, Shell Trap, and then Nitro Tank to get your other Turtonator and your other fire attackers ready to go after Turtonator dies. It's still really nice to get a turn 1 Kiawe to Turt, because then you can Bright Flame the next turn, attach another energy, then Bright Flame again, and you get that early pressure the same way you do with Ho-Oh Salazzle. So there's just small differences between the decks, which attacker's the main attacker, and it's really a preference. I think both decks are about Turtonator Volcanion and Ho-Oh Salazzle. I think they're both about the same in terms of how good they are. It's just preference. Personally, I like the Turtonator Volcanion, but I do agree that the Ho-Oh Salazzle, like the speed and just early pressure it puts on, and then the late game pressure with Salazzle is just really ridiculous sometimes. Okay, so those are the decks that I put in tier 2. Now, I know a lot of you are probably thinking, well, there's a lot of other good decks that I didn't list, and the next tier coming up is tier 3, but I don't necessarily consider tier 3 when I'm talking about decks to be bad. I know a lot of people say, oh, it's tier 3, and they think that's a bad deck, but let's get into my definition of what tier 3 is. I think tier 3 decks have a few very good matchups, or mostly 50-50 matchups across the board, while having a few poor matchups. So these decks have some glaring weaknesses, and I think that any of the decks in tier 3 would have to hit its few desired matchups throughout Swiss to make it to day 2. But if any of these have a large presence and are piloted by good players, I'm sure 1 or 2 will make it into day 2. So summed up, I think tier 3 decks are good and have potential, but have weaknesses that meta decks can easily exploit. And I'll explain what I mean by weaknesses that the meta decks can easily exploit as we go over the decks. A few of these decks are damage spread focused, so a Mr. Mime can very easily shut down their strategy until you get the Mr. Mime out of there. So a lot of these decks, like, they want to spread against Gardevoir and then devolve them, or at least that's their plan for Gardevoir. But Gardevoir can just put a Mr. Mime in and stop that right away. So that's like a weakness that's easily exploited. The first deck in tier 3 in my list, I really want to put it in tier 2, but I just feel like you can easily shut it down. If I had to change one of my tier 3 decks to a tier 2, it would be the first one. After that, the rest of the decks are in no specific order. So the first one is Ninetales Coco Espeon. This is one of my favorite decks. It's really fun to play. The decisions you make are really impactful. I think it's a really skill-based deck. I believe it was Andrew Mahone over at Darium's competitive Pokemon channel that said it's kind of like playing a chess game with this deck. I could be wrong, but I believe he said that, and I completely agree. I really like decks that have a lot of moving parts and a lot of decisions to make and a lot of choices, and you can adapt to different matchups and play them different ways. So against Gardevoir with this deck, you want to Flying Flip and Ice Blade, put down Po-Town, and then Miraculous Shine and devolve their Gardevoirs. But like I said, Mr. Mime can stop the Flying Flip damage and it can stop the Ice Blade damage, so that really hurts. This deck, it doesn't auto-lose to Metagross. It is weak to Metagross, so Metagross one-shots it, but there are situations where you Flying Flip and Ice Blade and Miraculous Shine to devolve, and you win that way. So it's not an auto loss, but Metagross is a very tough matchup. And I just think sometimes this deck doesn't get going the way you want it to. Sometimes you'll miss an Aqua Patch. Excuse me. Against Ho-Oh Salazzle, if they get the fast Ho-Oh going with a Choice Band, they'll one-shot everything in your deck, and that can be a very, very fast and painful match. So, like I said, I think this could be tier two. I'm just iffy on claiming that it's tier two right now. I'm testing it a lot. If I was going to play any tier three deck, any of my decks in tier three here, for Hartford this weekend, it would probably be Ninetales. I just think it's, like I said, a lot of fun. I don't think I'll get bored of playing it after 9 rounds of Swiss. I think it can beat most decks. I think it is very adaptable to whatever you see across the table from you, and that's what I like about. That's what I like in decks that I play. Next is Decidueye Ninetales. Post rotation, this was like a pet deck of mine right away after we lost Forest and Vile Plume and Shaman. And this was a deck that I wanted to make work without those cards right off the bat. I think this, going back to the description I made of tier 3, that decks have a few very good matchups and then a few very poor matchups and exploitable weaknesses. I think this is a perfect example of that. Because Decidueye Ninetales can spread against Gardevoir, can spread against Metagross, any stage 2 decks, really. It can spread and then devolve with Espeon, and that's its win con. But you can just easily, like I said again about Tapu Koko and Ninetales, you can just put Mr. Mime down and it stops your early damage spread. It doesn't stop Feather Arrows, however, which is important to note, but it does stop the early Koko spread. This also has a very bad matchup against any fire variant, which I think fire is going to be. I don't think it's going to be the most played deck, but I definitely think I think it's likely that it'll make up about 5 to 10% of the meta being fire variants, just because people love Volk, people love fire decks. The Kiawe is really nice. It has a lot going for it. Also, Metagross is getting hype because of the Gardevoir hype, so fire is going to be there in some shape or form, and that's bad for Decidueye. But I do think if this deck was to hit its like 3 good matchups, maybe a couple iffy ones, I could see this making day 2, especially piloted by good players. I've been seeing a lot of players posting League Cup standings with Decidueye Ninetales involved. One of my teammates played Decidueye Ninetales at a League Cup a couple weeks ago, and just they didn't see a Gardevoir all day in a 6-round League Cup while I played against 3 mirror matches of Gardevoir. So it's all about, there's a lot of variance. Like, even if the field is completely made up of your good matchups, you can hit the bad ones. So this is a deck that I feel is really chancy to play because you can hit a bunch of Gardevoirs and Metagross and Greninja, which is easy because you just one-shot them. So you can hit a bunch of good matchups, but you could also just have a rough day of iffy matchups and fire decks. So this one's like a big chance playing, in my opinion. Next is Vikabulu. There is a lot of talk around like the Facebook groups, Hey Fonte and Verbank, about, is Vikabulu a bad deck? Is it not getting enough love? Is it underrated? Is it overrated? I think it has a lot of 50-50 matchups and a lot of matchups you really have to work for. Its win con, in my experience against Gardevoir, is early flying flip, so that it puts the Gardevoirs in range of a Nature's Judgment knockout with a Choice Band. But if Gardevoir is playing Mr. Mime or some sort of healing like Max Potion and Acerola, even Fairy Drop like we saw on a Bremen Regionals list, then Vikabulu has a tough time because it can't one-shot Guardy. And as insane as it is, Guardy can ramp up to 5 energy and a Choice Band and just one-shot your Tapu Bulu. So I'm not saying that Gardevoir is the only deck that matters to beat, but it is a very prevalent deck. It's a very strong deck, and it's a fan favorite. I'm sure Gardevoir is going to be all over the place at Hartford. But this deck does have a lot of 50-50s, like I said. I think if you play this deck, you have to know it inside and out and know the other decks inside and out, because you're going to have a lot of tough matches throughout the 9 rounds of Swiss. In my opinion, it just feels inconsistent to me a lot of times. Like, some games I'll get a turn to Vikavolt, and there's Nature Judgment every turn for the game. And then other turns I'll just have the Vikavolt in hand but no Rare Candy. I'll have the Rare Candy in hand but no Vikavolt. And then also, it has a poor Metagross matchup, and this deck can easily falter to Garbotoxin if you don't hit your field blowers when you need them. So I'm not really sure where I stand with Vikabulu. I definitely think it's tier 3 according to my tier definitions. I could see it making top 32. I'm not sure if I could see it winning the whole tournament, but I do think it's a good deck. I just don't think it's great. So, Drampagarb / Espeon Drampagarb. If I were to play this deck, I think Tord Reklev, if that's how you say his name, the guy who won the North American Intercontinentals, he also got second, I believe, at Bremen Regionals. His Espeon Drampagarb list from Bremen Regionals, I think it's a really, really great deck. A really, really great list for the deck. I built it. It seems like a lot of fun to play. I just find it feels underwhelming against a good bit of the meta. Tord put in an Espeon EX in this list as well to combat some of the Stage 2 decks, which I think is really cool. I do really like Tord's list. I think if you're playing Espeon Garb or Espeon Drampagarb, you should take a look at his list and build off of that. I think it's a very consistent deck. I just think it feels underwhelming in my opinion. It has a poor Metagross matchup because you lost Flareon from Ancient Origins that changes your Espeon's typing to fire, so it's like really impossible to kill a Metagross GX. And other than that, it doesn't have like terrible matchups. It has a lot of tough 50-50s you really have to work for. In my opinion, the Guardy matchup is sketchy. I've heard a lot of talk on the Guardy matchup that Espeon Drampagarb is slightly favored in it, but I don't know. I think that's a tough matchup. That it's probably very skill intensive. I played it a bunch. Probably not too much. I've probably played about 10 games of Espeon Drampagarb versus Guardy on both sides of it, and every time Guardy won. Like I said, I just feel like this is very underwhelming. But I think it's a consistent deck. I think if you're trying to just get some kind of points, like top 128, top 256, if there's enough people for those points, I think this is a good consistent deck that you won't get a lot of like dead hands out of, and I think it's a good deck to go for some kind of points with. This deck is Russell Lepar's Weavile, Coco, Espeon, Necrozma, Turtonator deck. You can find the list on someone's PC if you're a subscriber. This deck's really interesting. I built it. It's a lot of fun. It has some very good matchups, and then it has some matchups that it doesn't have a solid game plan against. What you basically want to do is you want to spread and then devolve with Espeon. And like I said, decks that have this game plan just really hit a wall against Mr. Mime. So, like, your game plan against Gardevoir is Flying Flip, hit some things with Rule of Evil, maybe Necrozma's GX attack, and then you devolve with Espeon. But none of those attacks are going to hit the benched Pokemon if Mr. Mime is down. So you have to take care of Mr. Mime first. They could always stretcher it back to hand, play it down again. You have to Guzma it, kill it. It's really a grind against any deck playing Mr. Mime as a tech. It also, you play, excuse me, you play Turtonator. That's your attacker versus like Golisopod. It's a good attacker versus Metagross. The deck can feel like a little clunky sometimes, but as long as you get Coco's streaming, Flying Flip every turn, you can come back in the late game and just spread for a bunch of prizes. This is another deck in the tier 3 that I think if you hit a few of your good matchups and they're not teched with a Mr. Mime, I think you can just like sweep. and do really, really well and make it to day 2. But I do think it's a hit or miss deck. Like, you're either going to hit your like 3 good matchups and your tough ones, or you're going to hit like your bad matchups and your tough ones, or decks teched against spread. Last is Greninja. Uh, I personally despise Greninja. It's very powerful if you get set up, but getting set up is the issue. I played this at Georgia Regionals last season, and I finished with, I think, like an average or slightly above average record maybe, but it was just a terrible time. I got Froakie donked like 4 times. The deck is inconsistent. I know a lot of people really, really like Greninja, and then there's a lot of people who say, I will never play it again. I'm one of the people who say I will never play it again. So it's known as one of the most inconsistent decks, but if it sets up correctly and can use its powers, it's probably one of the strongest decks. It's easily countered by a single card, Giratina, the promo that stops breaks from using their abilities or having abilities, rather. And that's just a single inclusion anyone can put in their deck if they don't want to lose to Greninja, and they play it down, and you cannot use Giant Water Shuriken. And that's like the whole point of your deck. So I'm not a fan of playing a deck that can be shut down by a single tech, and I also don't like decks that are known for just getting dead hands and draw pass, hoping to get a bench Pokemon, hoping to get the Energy Frogadier, hoping your Frogadiers aren't prized. It's just not my kind of deck, but I do think it deserves to be on the tier list. It also has a very poor matchup versus Vikabulu and Golisopod Garbodor. I don't expect Vikabulu to be super present. I do expect it to be there, but I do expect Golisopod Garb to be a large portion of the meta. So I wouldn't be confident playing Greninja Break myself. So that's the end of the tier list. These are all of the decks that I mentioned on the tier list if you wanted to look at it in full. Like I said, these are all my opinions. This is my tier list and my definitions of the tiers. If you would like to see any of my lists for these decks, if you want to see me playing these decks on PTCGO in the next few days before Hartford, please leave a comment. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and like, and also you can follow me on Twitter to keep up with my my day at Hartford this upcoming weekend. On my Twitter, I'll be trying to post between every round what deck I played against and my match record. So I'll leave my Twitter link in the description below. Thank you guys and have a good day.